absolute worst thing that someone could tell you, okay? And I have to say, to be very honest with you, there is a lot of terrible writing advice out there. And the one that I absolutely hate the most, and I mean, I abhor this one, it's that good writing takes a lot of time. This is toxic, man. This is the toxic romanticization of ultimately that guy that spent 200 years ago or 100 years ago, who spent a decade or 50 years of his life writing one book. And these old literary hags cannot get over that. They have to remind everyone that this took 50 years to write. This took 10 years to write. You can write a book that takes 1 year. You can write a book that takes half a year. And it could be very good. A good story can take a lot of time, yes. But that by no means insinuates that if you spend the next 10 years of your life writing one book, that when you publish it, it's gonna sell, or it's going to be a very, very beloved piece of media or highly critically acclaimed. You can spend a decade of your life writing a terrible book. Effectively, in fact, you would be better off as a writer if you write at least one book a year so that you can get better, you can get feedback, you can have a much more frequent churn out where every time you get better. You can write 10 books, you can get them out there, you can get the critique from them, and 10 years, that's 10 books, 10 rounds of critique and feedback, and 10 cycles of editing that you've gone through as a writer. And the person who has only written, the person that compared to you, the person who has only written, let's say, one book in that time, they simply haven't gone through as much and as many cycles of repeated feedback and editing as you did. And they certainly has not outputted the same volume of words that you did. You are substantially more developed as a writer. You also are substantially more viable in terms of the capacity to actually sell something, to actually get out there, to actually put something out there. So, this is a toxic notion. It romanticizes a fallacy. It doesn't mean simply because something takes a lot of time that it is good. At some point, diminishing returns, because this is how the human body works. After a while, you keep going, keep going, right? You keep editing the story, rewriting chunks of it. But after a while, maybe after 3 years, after 4 years, honestly, from the 4th year to the 9th year, there'll be very little difference. And it's not going to be any different in the 10th year. The story will stagnate. You will reach ultimately a peak because it's effectively an inverted logarithmic curve. So I have to be very honest when I say I hate the notion of this idea. Toxic nonsense. And the next one actually ticks my BS alert. Dialogue has to be realistic. It has to be natural. It has to sound exactly how it comes out of your mouth. And I'm not sure where this comes from. Perhaps maybe it comes from Hemingway and those classic books in literature, however, or in literary fiction. However, I have to say, to be honest, when you are writing characters that are supposed to be 3,000 years old in far, far into the future, or you're writing wizards or somewhere else, I don't think that always writing what sounds natural to you is ultimately going to be the effective thing. When you're writing dialogue in fiction is not dialogue in the real world. It simulates conversation. It is not actually conversation because it's way too focused. Way too focused in order for it to be an actual conversation. So if you are trying to write dialogue in a way that it always comes out natural, the way people talk, then you are going to have to sit down, get a cup of tea, and go on 1,000 different tangents. Because have you ever heard two people having conversations? You yourself probably go on a lot of tangents. And that's what I mean, that a lot of people just simply blurt out. They literally vomit out this nonsense. I don't know where they get it from. Tying into that is the next toxic thing that really pisses me off. And it's that quantity is never good, man. Quantity over quality. Quantity over quality. Quantity sometimes can lead to a damaging outcome where you are outputting so many books, so many words, you simply cannot give each of those books the focus and the time it needs. But by no means is publishing a book every year or every half a year a certain doom for the quality of your writing. You can still output a publishable quality manuscript every single year, and that means you have 365 days. If you are writing 1,000 words every day, you are writing 365,000 words every single year. If a book is 100,000 words, you can rewrite that book 3 times over and over and over and publish it. I'm saying quantity is not evil. And simply because something takes longer doesn't mean it will be higher quality. Effective execution, the character conflict, the internal conflict of those characters, the quality of your world building and prose and plot and so on and so forth, that and your capacity to establish the story early on, effectively to hook the audience, and to execute that by using many different types of subplots throughout the story with an overarching plot, and to reach a satisfying conclusion for both the plot and the internal conflict of the characters and so on and so forth. That makes a good book. And to conclude this miserable list of things that I absolutely, from the deep guttural gut, I abhor, is effectively write what you know. This is a terrible advice. Write within your culture. Otherwise, it's cultural appropriation. Hell no. You can do research into other cultures because you are a writer. You can depict those cultures. You simply have to do a good job. Moreover, you might not know rocket science, but you can study, ultimately, fundamental, foundational rocket science, specifically the conservation of momentum. You can learn about a specific impulse, which is exhaust velocity divided by the gravity well that you are in. And on top of that, you can learn how the rocket equation correlates the final velocity with the current velocity plus the exhaust velocity multiplied by a ratio of the initial mass to the final mass. Okay, that's the rocket equation. You can learn about that. You can learn how to use it. How does a rocket accelerate in deep space? What is orbital mechanics? You can learn about potential energy. Effectively, you are in a gravity well. Mass multiplied by gravity multiplied by height gives you your potential energy. If you want to go to a higher orbit, which means to escape the gravity well, you can trend toward escaping that gravity well, means that you can effectively find out how much energy, how many joules do you need, because you know the potential energy that you have to do to effectively gain. So with the conservation of mechanical energy, you can find out the exact joules of kinetic energy. So you can from there find out how much rocket fuel you need. And you have to take into account your dry mass and so on and so forth. These are basic things that you can learn. You might be a journalist, but you can learn these things. Conservation of momentum is not a mystery that you can never understand. It doesn't take a lot to understand that. You can literally teach yourself basic foundational rocket science in order to write a science fiction story that allows you to use that rocket science, the basics at least, in a way as to help you understand how things would actually be happening in deep space if you want to write a harder story. Same thing goes for another culture. You could be an American. You can do research on, let's say, Japanese culture. Or, for example, Nigerians. You could do research on the Hausa. Or you could do research on the Fulani people, or the Igbo people, or the Yoruba. You could do all these different people in Nigeria. You could understand their culture, their ethnic religions, their dominant Abrahamic religions, Christian, Muslim, and so on and so forth. There's even some Jews in Nigeria. So at the end of the day, you can learn the different folklore, how they think, how they behave. You can do the research. You do not have to stick with what you know. You can always add more. You can always learn. That's the point. You're a human being. You're not some AI that is a stock, needs another update, man, in order to be able to do anything that keeps up with the trends. So I abhor this suggestion, this notion, this idea of this is not yours, you cannot write this culture, or you cannot write about that particular field of science, or you can't do this and that simply because you don't know, and you only stick to what you know. Trust me, man, most writers don't know much of anything outside of just writing stories, unless they have an expertise in the real world. But then again, if you do that, it means you have two expertise. You can write stories and you have another discipline in the real world. It can mean, therefore, you can learn a third one. Or you could understand the foundations for 100 others. They say a jack of all trades, a master of none, but still better than a master of one. That's the complete one, I think. So you can learn. You don't have to stick to what you know. So these are terrible things that I absolutely hate, abhor, piss me off when I hear them. Oh, dialogue has to be realistic. Oh, if it didn't take a lot of time, it cannot be a good book. Quantity is demonized. People who ultimately output a lot of writing are always demonized. A lot of books demonized, dehumanized sometimes. And the fact that some people will just advise you legit. I remember when I was younger, one of my friends actually told me, you should just stick to writing maybe science fiction because you studied engineering, you are an engineer, you should try to maybe use that knowledge in order to just write sci-fi. And I'm like, dude, I want to write fantasy. Okay? I do engineering in the real world, but I want to have fun. Get out of here, man. Yes, and so you can learn about wizards in Middle Earth, that's fine. So anyways, I hope you understand where I'm going with this. These are terrible, 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 absolutely terrible pieces of writing advice. I recommend you avoid these things at all costs. Anyways, I hope you took something from this video. Have a nice day. Bye bye. Please subscribe. Bye bye.